With all the success you've had, do you still face, are you currently facing any fears, or are there fears about the horizon?
I have to give you amazing props. You're such a curious person about the people that you talk to. I love it. I love it, man.
Thank you.
The answer is, thank you. Are you kidding me? I've been on a ton of podcasts and people just same questions.
Welcome to the Idea Climbing Radio Show. Today, we're discussing how to embrace curiosity to find your next big idea. And my guest is Carla Johnson. Imagine this: no longer is the status quo the sure bet. In today's world, standing still makes you a sitting duck. Disruption's inevitable. But if anyone's going to disrupt your company, shouldn't it be you? That's where curiosity comes in. As the world's leading innovation architect, Carla has spent 20 years working with leaders, conducting research, and authoring numerous books. She's developed frameworks to teach people how to redefine what innovation means to them, and then equips leaders to make innovation everybody's business. The result is a culture that becomes a playground of limitless potential while also experiencing unprecedented growth and alignment. Carla, thank you for making the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Mark. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Before we dive into some of the strategies around curiosity and really embracing it, how did you discover it to be a subject that you teach and talk about? What's your story about curiosity?
It's kind of I followed the path of what I loved and what I was interested and believed was important myself. I actually started out in university as an electrical engineering major. So you think, how did you go from like one extreme to another? But I was great at math and science in high school. I have 4 older siblings who are all very left-brained engineers, military, attorney kind of people. So I just thought, well, that was my path. And as I went along, I found that I was curious about these things, but it was much too structured for how I like to think. I'm actually very, very right-brained. I ended up with a master's in history of all things. And it was the stories and the curiosity about why things happened that drew me to history. And my background is actually working in business to business marketing. And I started out working for architecture firms. And it was what I learned from the design architects that really influenced how I looked at creating connections with customers and building those relationships and growing a business. And so when I talk about being an innovation architect, as I went through marketing, I found that there's a lot that we can architect into marketing and the way that we think and how we do things by being more curious, by being more innovative, by being more creative about how we think. And that road just eventually led me into the world of innovation and creativity. And I'm always looking at how do we get back to like the very first beginning of what we need to do. And I think with creativity and innovation, that like first seed nugget is to re-spark that feeling of curiosity that everybody naturally has. We all had it as kids, but we kind of have forgotten how to do it as adults, or we don't understand how to apply it in the adult world.
So how do you re-spark it? Because that's so true. As kids, I mean, anything is the limit. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a cowboy, everything in between. As an adult, when it goes away, how do you re-spark that, at least to get it started?
I think the biggest thing to re-spark it is to understand that curiosity doesn't have a purpose other than for you to practice being curious. Like we're not looking for a definite outcome when you practice curiosity. So when you think as a kid, what you were like as a kid, or if you have kids or spend time around kids, they don't have any purpose behind why they do the things that they do. They just naturally let their mind roll in the ways that are natural as a child. And so as we move from childhood into like school age, and especially middle school and high school, as we prep for college and then college into the real world, we're told, those are kind of childish things. Those are things you need to put on the shelf because we have real work to do now. Now, granted, there has to be a balance between allowing curiosity to flourish and the constant why that comes as children, and the reality of, learning subjects and getting schoolwork done and getting a job and getting work done. But I think things have swung so far to our focus on productivity, on data, on tracking things and measurability that we've forgotten not only the joy of what happens when we just explore for exploring's sake, but also the beautiful outcomes that can come out of it that we don't really expect.
So how do you start practicing it? What are some
I think one of the biggest things that we can do is when we have a situation or any kind of problem that we're working on at work, one of our natural things is, well, let's get it done, right? We have a deadline. We need to be productive, is to put some of that productivity urge aside and really just sit with the problem. And look at what are 100 possible things that we could do. Don't answer them, but 100 different things that we could do. So research actually shows that we don't start to get to creative ideas until we've gone through the first 200 ideas, which sounds crazy because you think about a brainstorm. Have you ever been in a brainstorm, Mark, where you went through 200 ideas?
No, I'd love to say I
No.
have, but no.
Yeah. And the reason is because your brain defaults to what's familiar. And so when we're in these meetings and we're trying to solve a problem, your brain goes, okay, I know this worked last time, or I know I didn't get shut down. I know it didn't cost me my job because I'm still here. It looks for the safe answers first. And so when we give our brain time to just really, really sit with the problem and let it relax and essentially give it space to say, oh, okay, I'm allowed to explore. I'm allowed to ask questions. And I think the beauty of sitting with the problem and asking questions is something that really can spark our curiosity, because all of a sudden we might start asking, well, we've always made this assumption about what our customers want. But what if we started to ask them this? And it may open this whole other area of opportunity for revenue, for growth, for connection, for relationships or loyalty, or a completely new customer experience that we never ever imagined. But when we rush to answer the question and don't spend time to sit with the question, that really, really shuts down our opportunity to be curious.
So, two-part question. How do you create a safe zone first for yourself and then other people if you're part of a team, managing a team, etc.? But starting with yourself, how do you create that safe zone to not be like, oh my God, I have to have an answer now?
Yeah. One of the stories I like to tell is that there was a company in the UK, and they were having an offsite to work on some strategy for their company. And they broke everybody up into groups. And it was a smaller company, 50 people or so. And so they said, here are the strategic things that we really want to work on. And one of the groups said, hey, can we share what didn't work at the end of the day? Like, essentially, can we share our failures? And I think that right there is a very key thing, for ourselves. I know I don't like to look bad. I want to have the right answer. I want to be the first one going, I know. But I think unless we're willing to go to the edge of what's possible and see what fails, we don't really understand the potential for what could be. And so with this company, what they did is, at the end of the day, it was in one of those kind of rustic buildings, and they had two big barrels, and they put an old door that they found across the top of them. And they said, we want to create an altar where people can come up and essentially confess what they failed at. And so people would stand, very, very vulnerable. You're standing in front of your boss, in front of your coworkers, and they said, here is what I failed at. Here's what I was trying to do. Here's how it turned out. But I think most importantly, here's what I learned. And it was that space to say, not everything is going to work out right. And if I'm always here hunting for the right answer, I miss all of these opportunities that are right here that I'm blind to. So I think that's an important thing for us. Like, if we can start with ourselves and try little experiments, they don't even have to be things at work. What is it that you can do at home and try? Like, my son, he just like picked up hip hop dancing because it's something he loves to do. He watches YouTube videos, he hangs out with his friends. And I'm thinking, I bet I could learn to do this. Okay, I will admit, failed miserably. But you know what? I now know my edge for that. And it doesn't mean I can't get better. It's just a matter of, do I want to commit the time to get better compared to other things that I, have to do every day? But I think the curiosity in me starts to go, well, what would it take to get better? And then I start to learn things in hip hop that help me with other things that I do, like something as simple as hiking or running or weightlifting. And those little curious things, those hobbies that we do, those really do fuel what we love to do. So I think when we understand what is it that we fail at and can learn from and then can apply to something else, that's very different. And so with this company, what they did is they created what they call the Church of Failure. And every single month they got together and people were required to share in front of the company, what is it that I completely failed at? And then what did I learn from it? And I think one of those things that came out of it is that after everybody shared their failure, the team, everybody else in the company applauded and clapped. And so there's that vulnerability of sharing the failure. But two, there's also the mind switch of sharing a failure where we think we will get reprimanded. We think we'll get in trouble. We might lose our job. We might lose our client, but instead we're getting cheered for it. And so the next time that somebody in that company would think, have that inflection point to think, do I push it a little further? If I do, I might fail. In their head, they're going, well, that's not so bad. I'm not going to lose my job. There's things I'm going to learn. We can all collectively come together and work through it. So it sets a completely different mindset. And I think even for us, if we can start to reframe that failure isn't the end, it's part of the journey and it's part of the learning. And actually, if you're not failing, you really aren't pushing the envelope enough. And I think the second thing out of that is to give ourselves space. Back to taking time to sit with the problem and the challenge. We rush so much, but what if we can just, and sometimes space is 5 minutes, to sit and to breathe and just give a little, levity to what can oftentimes be a serious challenge, a serious deadline, but just 5 minutes to really think through, what am I going to say and what could I possibly consider?
How much time do you spend? I mean, if there is a certain amount of time or just a general idea of acknowledging failures to learn from them and then focusing on what could be? I mean, how do you split the two, and how do you know how much? Because you don't want to wallow at the same time. You don't want to jump to a conclusion. How do you split the time between analyzing failures and analyzing what could be?
I think even like if you think about the agile methodology at the end of every project or oftentimes sprints, they'll have what they call retrospectives. You might as well call those failure evaluations. Not that everything in the previous sprint was a failure, but what they want to look at is what went right, but also what didn't go as planned. And sometimes even just 15 minutes that they spend every 2 weeks can make all the difference to help people see, oh, it didn't work the way I expected it to. So we don't have to call it a failure, but let's reevaluate and have some input from other people. Sometimes just giving yourself some time and space gives you that objectivity to reflect on how things turned out. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 15 minutes, but I think the important thing here, Mark, is to do it consistently. There's a lot of people who, from a productivity standpoint, at the end of their day will reflect back on their day and say, oh, what could I have done? And sometimes that's even, where could I have spent more time just thinking and considering, rather than trying to pack too much into a day, rather than jumping to an answer, rather than whatever other behavior that they recognize. Sometimes people do it at the end of the week, but I think unless you do it on a, fairly frequent basis and commit time to it, it's hard to do.
So how do you learn from failures? Could you unpack that a little bit more? Is it a structure? Is it a whatever step process? How do you learn from failures and not just wallow in pity?
I think one of the big things to learn from failure is to first understand what is it that you were hoping to have as an outcome. And a lot of times when I see failures, it's because people weren't clear about what the outcome was that they wanted to have. And that can be as simple as just, how did we run a meeting? There are positive meeting structures. There's setting expectations. There's understanding, do all the people in the meeting actually need to be in the meeting? Basic things like that. What do we want the outcome to be? How much time do we have? What's our agenda? Sometimes meetings fail because nobody knows what it is we're trying to accomplish. So, you can look back that way at the end of a meeting and say, on a scale to 1 and 5, how would you rate this meeting? And see what people in the meeting give you as feedback. So it can be something as simple as that. So know your objective, actively ask for feedback. Look at the outcomes, like define the outcomes ahead of time of what you want to accomplish. And how do those measure up to what you actually experienced as outcomes? And oftentimes people wait until the very end to do a retrospective or to reflect on some of these things, but just doing some check-ins along the way to say, how are we doing? Do we need to adjust the ship a little way? Or, along the way, or are things okay? Or, what are some other things that we could consider? What are we struggling with? And there's always a lot of assumptions when we get heads down in our work every single day. I know I have my routine, and oftentimes I'm heads down and I'm in this routine. And because I'm in it, I'm blind to all of these opportunities out of here until I have maybe a call or a meeting to check in on something. And then somebody else asks me a question and I think, well, I never even thought about that. And it seems so obvious. It seems so obvious. And I think asking those questions and being curious in that way along the way and having those conversations and not always assuming your process is just the way to do the thing. And just being heads down. I think that's the biggest thing, is just all of the assumptions that productivity is the most important thing all the time. Because sometimes without curiosity, we're actually more unproductive than if we had taken some time and space to sit with our project, our challenge, or our customer, and make some time to ask these questions. So, it's as far as a set time, it varies on what it is that you're working on. But I think there's a balance, and I can't say what it is for everybody, but there's a balance between what questions do we need to ask and how often do we need to continue asking questions versus the reality of we do have to get work done. And I think that depends on the size of the project, maybe the perceived chaos of the project. Is it something completely new? Is it something you've done consistently over time? Because maybe if it's a process you've done consistently over time, I've worked with this example with some clients where we break it down step by step by step and put it on Post-it notes, across a big wall. And we say, okay, let's actually look at every single little minute step that happens and who's involved. And is this really the right process? So that's something that takes a little bit longer to unpack. But I think if you have some set processes in place, maybe once a year you look at this. If you've never ever looked at those processes since they were created, heck, look at the world we're in now compared to the world last year versus 5 years ago. Absolutely, it's time to just unpack them and look at them and see if they really are the right thing.
Well, once you come up with all these ideas, maybe not 200, but you come up with a lot of them, how do you know when to start narrowing them down? When to say, okay, we're not going to put 10 more on the whiteboard, whatever it might be. How do you start to narrow them down and go from brainstorming to structure of some sort?
I like to have people create an objective statement that has 3 parts. And the first is, we need new ideas too. So what is it that you're trying to have done? Is it to create a strategy for 2025? Is it a customer retention campaign? Is it just, how you run your business? Something as simple as that. And then the next part is, so we can. And while people can generally answer the first part, we need new ideas too. They often, even executives that I work with in companies who say, we have a clear strategy and direction, when I ask them, so we can, like, what's the outcome that you want? Either 1, they can't define it, or 2, they can't agree on it. And even like me as an individual company owner, a solopreneur, even I struggle with that, to clearly define, what is it I'm trying to accomplish ultimately? Is it growth? Is it retention? Is it brand awareness? What are these things? And then the third part is, with these constraints. So we all know every idea would be an amazing idea if we didn't have the reality of things like budget, time, market conditions, things like that. And so I suggest that people use between 2 and 4 constraints. I think if you have less than 2, it's not something that could be realistic in the world when you go to try and execute it. If you have more than 4, you're putting on so many constraints that it just crushes the idea and it will never go anywhere. So we'll be optimists here, Mark. Take your collection of 200 ideas and start to run them against that objective statement. how, are they realistic? And sometimes what you'll find is immediately you'll get rid of 75% of them. But there might be a little bit of a nugget in that crazy idea in part of the 75% that you can add to one of the 25% that you kept. And all of a sudden you sit with it. And then maybe you start to go down the rabbit hole of, it sounds kind of crazy, but I think there's something here we could work with. And you get curious again in that way. Then you start to see some opportunities. And the next step that I say to be curious is to begin to swap hats. Like you may say that would never work in my industry. But what if you said, well, Disney is amazing at customer experience. What if we swapped hats with Disney and we started to think like Disney as a graphic design firm? What would that look like? And as we start to apply that filter to these ideas and how they shore up against our objective statement. So I think there's a lot of ways to bring that curiosity in and blend it with the reality of how do we filter through our ideas, and then end up on the other side with just a handful of ideas, which is fine, but they're now qualified ideas that fit the potential of your objective statement. They're different. They're fresh. You've spent time with them. You've gone down the rabbit hole to really see what's possible here. They're different as in you can think, what would a Disney do if they tried to execute this? What would a Starbucks do? What would a liquid death, water company do if they did that? And all of a sudden, not only does that really fuel our curiosity, it fuels our excitement about what's possible. And man, when you can add energy to yourself and your ideas, to your team or to your, company like that, it's amazing how fast that energy just spills over from your company into your customers, into your vendors. And all of a sudden you have an amazing energy that you kind of forgot what it's like to come to work to every single day.
So when you're sifting through all these ideas and getting to that 75% and 25%, how do you recognize the good ideas? Because I'd imagine there's so many out there to unpack and so many possibilities. How do you recognize, okay, that's going to make it into the 25%?
Well, I think if you put it up against your criteria that's in your objective statement, there's obviously 75%, and I'm just kind of making that number up, won't be realistic against that. But that's where the beauty comes in, is that you have to get some of those crazy ideas out, or even some of the status quo ideas. Oftentimes that's what I see fall by the wayside is we've already done that. We tried that. We saw our competitor do that. But in the process of coming up with the ideas, your brain does a dump, and it dumps the familiar, the safe. And when you're looking for something different, that doesn't always, cut it anymore. And so if you can, look at what is it that I'm truly trying to accomplish? If what I'm trying to accomplish is brand awareness, and one of the ideas is, let's sponsor somebody to go to the moon. Well, that's an obvious one that it won't match. But the fact that you went through the process of coming up with that idea sparks something in your brain that helps it start to see opportunities where before it would have shut them down. And that's the biggest thing that happens with brainstorm sessions, is that we bring people together and we have them start cold to come with ideas. And maybe we get 8 to 10 ideas, and they're all right, but there's nothing necessarily either amazing or crazy in there. Or if it is, it doesn't work against the objective statement of what we're actually trying to accomplish. And it's the combination of all these things together that help people start to narrow down a lot of ideas into good ideas, into executable ideas.
Well, when it comes to executable ideas, this is a great transition. When do you start building a strategy of, we've narrowed down the executable, the good ideas, whatever you want to call them? What does a strategy after that moving forwards look like?
Well, I think it depends on the idea and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Like when you think about your listeners, what's some of the big problems that you hear from them?
Building relationships, marketing, things along those lines.
Okay, so you take something as maybe as simple as building relationships. Oftentimes, maybe the strategy is we need new ideas to engage our customers so that we can improve customer retention by 10%. With these constraints, maybe we have a budget of $1,000 even, and we want to do it by the end of the year. So that's what, 4.5 months now for us roughly. So the first thing to start to do is, one, what are the ideas that you have that would fit within your budget? And all of a sudden you start to see, okay, money isn't the great equalizer. And in fact, oftentimes it's the companies who have the smallest budgets who do the most creative work. So in one of my books on innovation, I tell the story of a guy named Dave Daigle. And Dave worked for the Office of Emergency Responsiveness at the CDC. And they had essentially no budget. But what they found was that they were coming into the season of hurricanes and tornadoes. It was, April, May of that year. And he said, historically, what they had always done is, distributed to the public. Here's a checklist of all of the things that you need to have ready in case of a tornado or a fire or a hurricane or something like that. Nobody ever read them. I mean, you talk about a yawner of a marketing campaign and what they were trying to accomplish. Nobody ever paid attention. And so this year they were sitting in their conference room. It was him and his 2 team members. And they said, what can we do that's different? Like, we know we need new ideas to get people to pay attention so that we can help them be better prepared and lessen the impact of these disasters. Here's our constraints. Like, we know the deadline when we have to send this communication out, and we know we essentially have no budget. And so one of them said, what's kind of interesting is I was watching the show The Walking Dead the other day. And so they had already been sitting with the problem. And then here's somebody who paid attention to something that caught their interest just as a regular person. So they went down the rabbit hole with the show The Walking Dead. And they talked about, like, zombies are everywhere. Everybody has zombie craze. And at the end of one of the shows, they actually showed the people running into one of the buildings of the CDC to get away from the zombies. And they said, here's a thought. What if instead of thinking like the CDC, we think like a show producer, and we put on a hat and think like that? And so they started to say, okay, if we were wanting to teach people, get them prepared to run away from a zombie attack, essentially what they need to prepare is the same as what they would need to prepare for natural disaster, for tornadoes, for hurricanes, for wildfires. So what they did is they took the same information they had, they repackaged it as how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse. And they won all sorts of awards. It just went crazy. They started to create these like novellas, like comic book sorts of things about how to survive a zombie apocalypse that, Mark, was the exact same information that they had been sharing for years that nobody ever read, that now people couldn't get enough of. And they won this national PR award for it, for the Hall of Fame. And so Dave said, here we are on stage and we're looking around, and, it's like Coke and Nike and IBM, companies with millions in marketing budgets. Their budget for this campaign was $87. And that was for a piece of stock art that they used for the original blog when they talked about how to survive a zombie apocalypse. So I think when we look at this, oftentimes I don't have enough money is a crutch. And so that's part of what happens when you get curious. Well, what if we didn't have any money? What if we were 6 and we're trying to solve this problem? 6-year-olds don't have a, black Amex to solve their, the things they want to create. Well, let's think like a 6-year-old then. And I think that's one of the things is to start to pick it apart and to look at what are the little things that we can do.
So when you're doing that, when you come up, and if you're in more of a leadership role and you recognize a good idea, what ways can you get the other people involved, stakeholders, if you will, or team members? How do you get them to persuade them to buy into your idea when you think you have a really good one?
I think one of the most important things, especially for a leader, is to get people involved in the idea. When you're a leader and you dictate an idea, people are like, here I am getting told again. But when you bring people in and you ask them, like, what do you think about this idea? How do you see it working? Like, what are some holes that we might have that I'm not seeing? When you get people involved and have them contribute, then they now have a piece of ownership of that idea. And when people have ownership of an idea, they feel like they really want to do what they can to help it succeed. They want to see their idea come into fruition. And I think especially for leaders, one of the things that I suggest they track and make public, whether it's a spreadsheet or oftentimes like put it up on a wall in the office, is have a tracking system with 3 columns. One is number of ideas. Like, how many ideas are we actually getting? The second column is, put into put in progress. How many are moving from their ideas into here's something we're actively looking to implement. And then the third one is completed. So these columns tell us things. If we're not getting any ideas, then we're not creating the kind of environment that has trust, that allows people to be vulnerable, back to the church of fail, that makes it feel that it's okay to share an idea. It's okay that an idea doesn't work out, because the more people feel safe to share their ideas and that their ideas will actually be heard and seriously considered, the more ideas you're going to get contributed. Then what we look at is how many of those ideas move over into you're putting them in play. Because what we see there is either the ideas are being accepted, or are they being shut down? Are they actually good ideas that are something that can respond to that objective statement? Or are they just like ideas somebody thought of and it's crazy and not realistic and not even a challenge, or it's not something that is thought through enough about how to execute it? And then the third part is how many are actually making it across the finish line? And if not very many are, the question is, well, why not? Is it processes or procedures that we have internally that don't make it happen? Is it that they were ideas that were dictated and not ideas that had buy-in? So each of these columns, it should look like a sales funnel. There should be a sales funnel on its side, a lot of ideas, few of them moved into execution, and then not everything that you put into trying to execute will actually be completed. And there's a lot of reasons. Not all of them are negative. Maybe a client canceled something, maybe a conference that you were working toward didn't happen, or you ended up with a different priority, market conditions shifted, whatever it was. There's reasons that not every idea goes through to execution and completion, but understanding why each of these columns has the number of tick marks in it that it does is very telling to an organization, especially to a leader.
Well, when you get all this done and it's through the funnels, how do you know when to stop brainstorming? Even if it's 5 ideas, not 200, but even if you come down to 5, when do you stop brainstorming and start executing? And how do you do that?
How do you stop brainstorming?
Once you get so many ideas, do you stop brainstorming or do you keep brainstorming?
Well, I think I think you always need ideas through every part of the process. So while people think of brainstorming as, like I did this brainstorm and I have this idea, or, a handful of ideas, now I'm done. The truth is we always need ideas to help solve problems at every point of the process. So lots of times people say, coming up with the idea is the easy part. It's the execution that's the hard part. It's actually coming up with great ideas makes execution so much easier. But when you understand the criteria of a great idea, we need new ideas. Like, what is it that you need ideas to? So what are we trying to accomplish? And then under what constraints? That really skyrockets the quality of the ideas that you have and makes it easier to execute. Now, once you have your, 2, 3, maybe you just have one idea that you're going to move into execution. Once you have that, you still will need to be curious. You're still going to need to be creative. There's still things that you're going to need to think of and think differently, because if this truly is a new idea, how it gets executed isn't going to be the same as how you've executed every single other idea. So I think that's always something to take into consideration, and maybe you get to a point where you've put this idea into execution and it isn't working the way you think. Instead of just killing it, well, let's be curious. Maybe we can find a way to make this happen. Maybe we just need to adjust things a little bit here and there. And that's why I say, coming up with the idea isn't the end of the idea phase, because we always need ideas all along the way, even through execution. And I think when do you know you're done with the idea and the execution? Well, back to your objective statement, what is it you were trying to accomplish? And what were your requirements? Oftentimes deadline is a requirement for an idea.
So what does execution look like? Is it just putting it into motion and going against the benchmarks you have when it comes? Unpack execution a little bit once you get through the process of brainstorming, knowing that new ideas could come into the fold, but at some point you got to take step 1, 2, 3 and execute and make something happen. How do you do that? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think execution depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes execution can take 5 minutes. Sometimes it can take, a day. Sometimes execution takes 6 months, 18 months. It depends on how big the idea is, how much impact it has on the business, and what kind of outcomes that you're looking for. So when I think of execution, sometimes there was a software company, and they would have innovation weeks once every 6 months. And they required everybody in the company to participate, because they said it doesn't make sense just to have the software people involved, because when we have an idea, it actually has to go through the rest of the company. It has to go through legal to get approved. It has to go through branding. It has to go through marketing. It has to go through sales. So we really need them involved, so we can look holistically at how do we make this idea happen? How do we execute it? So there was a woman who worked in finance, and after the week was done, she came back and she looked around at her own domain. And she said, okay, if there's things that I can improve, if there's things I can think differently about, like, let me get curious and look at the work that I do. So she realized there was a report that she did every single month manually, and it was 40 hours every month. So you think 1 week out of 4 weeks every month. I mean, it sounds absolutely crazy, right? But she started to look at this and she said, okay, well, I learned enough from the IT people while I was with them this week that I can teach myself a programming language. And then she wrote a program, and that 40-hour a month report is now a 12-minute a month report.
Oh, come on.
And so, I mean, is it wildly innovative? I mean, what she did, you could look at it and go, well, like, anybody could do that. But one, she was curious enough to look. And two, when you think about what that did to her productivity, she's now essentially gained 25% of her year. So she now has the opportunity to do 15 months of work in 12 months. And you think, if you're a solopreneur, if you're a small business, if you're an entrepreneur, getting that kind of productivity spike is crazy. And I think the biggest thing is that she really now understood she had control over her domain, and she comes to work knowing she's not going to have to do that like soul-sucking, grind, boring report every single month. And so what does execution look like? How long does it take? It depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Mhm.
But it can be 5 minutes. It can be 50 weeks. It depends on how big or small your objective is.
With everything we talked about, we covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. When it comes to curiosity, particularly embracing it and then leveraging curiosity to be productive in business, if you were to tell people, you know what, we talked about a lot, but if nothing, do this one thing to get started, at least this one thing, start doing it. What would you say that one thing would be above all?
I would say spend the first 15 minutes of your week, whether it's by yourself or if you have a team meeting or team call, and start asking questions about what you're working on. Don't answer any of them. Spend the first 15 minutes purely asking questions.
That is excellent. Thank you so much for the time today. I appreciate it, Carla. If people want to find you online, what place or places should they go?
Well, my website is Carla with a C, carlajohnson.co. There's no M. I say it's .co for the great state of Colorado. And on there, you can sign up for my newsletter, where I have stories and tools and tactics about how to put all of this into play. And that comes out every other week. And then you can always connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know you heard it on the show, because I always like to know how people learned about me and my work. And I love to connect with people who have heard us in the audience.
Thank you again. This has been excellent, Carla.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure to be here.
And Steen, thank you for tuning into the Idea Climbing radio show today. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something great out of it that you can take into your own life and use to be better in your own life. If you want more great shows like this, go to 216thenet.com. You want to see more of my interviews, radio show, and podcast? Go to markjcartertv.com. Again, that's markjcartertv.com and 216thenet.com. Hope to see you on one of those platforms, or maybe even both.